Okay, I think we should get started now and people will join as we go along. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kulafelo Kugler and I am a PhD fellow at the University of Lucerne. Welcome to Trade Policy Exchange event on the state of play of e-commerce after MC12. This event has been moved a few times, has been planned and moved, because as we know, MC12 was a bit of a moving target since 2020. But we're very happy to be able to have it and to discuss actually what has been an outcome in MC12. Before I get started with the reason why we're here today, I just want to welcome you and to let people know who don't know what Trade Policy Exchange is, let you know about the organization. This is a relatively young organization that was started about 3 years ago, just before the pandemic. And just like everybody who was living before the pandemic, we were thinking of democratizing, trade policy and trade law knowledge, thinking about including new voices and highlighting the talents and the work of people who are not as well known in trade, but of course are doing a lot of work in trade. But actually the pandemic helped us democratize this because we put everything online, and we're very happy to be able to provide really quality programming, especially with the type of panelists that we've been able to attract. So thank you very much. Please follow us on LinkedIn at Trade Policy Exchange, follow us on Twitter at Trade Policy X, and of course on our website, www.tradepolicyexchange.org. Now, before we get started, let me just introduce to us our very knowledgeable panel that will talk about these issues this afternoon. First, we have Nicholas Suzuki, who is a trade policy advisor at International Trade Intelligence. Next, we have Lee Tatil, who is a visiting fellow at the Institute of International Trade, University of Adelaide. Then we have Dr. Radhika Kumar, who's an advisor in infrastructure policy digital at the Commonwealth Secretariat. And last but not least, we have Quan Zhao, who's a trade and services advisor at the International Trade Center. Now, let me just give you a quick rundown on what each of them will be addressing before we get started. Nicholas will discuss the outcomes of the MC12, just to put us up to speed as what's happened, and especially on the moratorium and on the e-commerce GSI, which is the joint statement initiative. He will, of course, address the challenges and also the implications of the moratorium not being extended and possibly the GSI not being concluded at the WTO. Lee, with her institutional knowledge of trade and services negotiations at the WTO, will provide us the negotiating history on e-commerce at the WTO. She will talk about the working party and of course the GSI as well. And she will also highlight the failure of the working party to progress, and also the different approaches of the main demandeurs, if you wish, the EU, the US, and China in the GSI negotiations. Next, we have Radhika, who will provide the Commonwealth states or developing country perspective on e-commerce. Why not many developing countries are engaging, and if they did, what would be the main consideration and needs for developing countries in digital trade issues, and maybe also how the WTO can make e-commerce or e-commerce negotiations more inclusive. Last but not least, Kwan will give us a perspective that we don't really think about, and this would be the view of the SMEs in e-commerce. Specifically, what could the WTO, if at all, could do to enhance the SMEs' experience in digital trade? So before I waste any more time, I'd like to turn to you, Nick. Thank you. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Okay, classic mistake. Here we go. Hi, thanks, Kolo. So it's probably good that this webinar didn't take place immediately after the Ministerial conference, and we all had a couple of days to reflect on the outcomes and messages from WTO member states. In the last 2 weeks, there was a lot of positive spin amongst trade officials who wanted to present the outcomes in a good light. And don't get me wrong, I think incremental progress for the multilateral trading system is very important. Even to keep the current economic order is an achievement in itself, because there are so many centrifugal forces that could tear it apart. So the fisheries agreement showed that the negotiation function of the WTO is not completely dead, and that the WTO can be a forum for sustainable development. But if the WTO wants to stay relevant in a world where trade in digital services is growing at a much faster rate than trade in goods, there will also need to be more outcomes in this area. And unfortunately, the outlook for a meaningful agreement on e-commerce at the WTO is rather bleak. Now, it's great to have Lee on this panel because she is probably the best person on the planet to recount the history of multilateral and plurilateral e-commerce negotiations at the WTO. But I think to most observers, it is also quite clear that even in the joint statement initiative, there has not been much progress on the most contentious issues, even if digital trade facilitation could be a potential landing zone. Instead, the most critical decision at MC12 has been about renewing an existing commitment, the moratorium on customs duties for electronic transmissions, at least until the next ministerial conference of the WTO or the end of March 2024. So let me give you a couple of observations about the moratorium debate at MC12 and where we are with the JSI. It has become quite clear that the hope of the business community and some WTO members that the moratorium could be made permanent was misplaced. Instead of being considered on its own merits, the moratorium was mostly used as a negotiation chip for other issues that were on the table at MC12. So WTO members pushed the can further down the road, and it is quite possible to actually see a similar play for the moratorium again at MC13 towards the end of 2023 or early 2024. Now, this also means that anybody who hopes to make a multilateral moratorium permanent will have to answer what would in return be offered to the WTO members wanting to end it. Still, there were some interesting negotiating dynamics at the ministerial conference. For example, China proposed to have an opt-out for countries that don't want to take part in the moratorium, even though this was apparently not taken up. There was also some discussion of spinning out the moratorium in a new joint statement initiative, apart from the JSI on e-commerce. So that might be another new area to watch in the coming months. And in spite of the USTR publicly claiming a leadership role in MC12, the US was also conspicuously absent from the negotiations on the moratorium. Lastly, the resistance to renew the moratorium came predominantly from India, Indonesia, and South Africa. But the latter two may not be able to withstand international pressure without India. So India was really the crucial actor in these negotiations. It was quite interesting to see that before MC12, there was a debate over the moratorium benefits in India. India is, of course, one of the world's leading exporters of IT services. So it may not be surprising that NASSCOM, India's leading IT business association, has come out in favor of renewing the moratorium. But in the Indian press, Indian government officials also said that their own calculations showed that the renewal of the moratorium would be in India's favor. In a similar vein, one could also ask why countries like Indonesia haven't already gone ahead and imposed customs duties on the content of electronic transmissions, such as digitally delivered video games or streamed music. Because as it stands, Indonesia and some other WTO members interpret the moratorium to only cover the medium of electronic transmissions. So by that definition, they would already not be restricted to impose customs duties on the content. Of course, many other WTO members disagree with this interpretation and say that the moratorium should also cover the content. So the compromise we saw at MC12 is that WTO members agreed they would continue the discussions on the scope and definition of the moratorium, which at least compels them not to take any unilateral action for now. The ministerial decision of MC12 also encourages WTO members to continue the discussion on the impact of the moratorium. Of course, those who follow these discussions closely know there has already been a lot of empirical work on this topic. On the one hand, there are studies by UNCTAD that emphasize revenue losses for developing countries from digitizable goods like CDs and DVDs that used to generate tariff revenues, but now enter a country tariff-free as digital services. On the other hand, there are studies by the OECD and others that show that the expected revenue losses are small compared to the overall welfare benefits from participating in the global digital economy without additional friction. Until now, the problem with the evidence presented in Geneva is that it hasn't convinced any WTO members to change their prior positions, and instead, it may have even hardened their stances. If there really is interest by members to have an honest debate about the impact of the moratorium, a possible way forward could now be more country case studies that show governments much more concretely what the impact of the moratorium would be. These case studies should not only look at revenue losses, but also at existing gaps and RTA commitments, as well as the economic benefits of continued free trade in digital services. Luckily, the co-conveners of the e-commerce JSI, so Australia, Japan, and Singapore, as well as Switzerland separately, launched a capacity building framework for e-commerce and digital trade at MC12, which could help governments in developing countries to get greater clarity on these issues. If the OECD base erosion and profit shifting framework is finalized in the coming months, it could also ease the pressure for developing countries, as it presents an alternative source of revenue from cross-border digital services that is less trade distorting than digital tariffs. I believe Lee will talk a bit more about the joint statement initiative. So let me just say for now that apart from the capacity building framework that I mentioned, there was no new announcement on the JSI at MC12. Now that in itself should not necessarily be interpreted as a failure of the JSI negotiations, because the internal timetable was not to be finished before the end of this year anyway. Although the JSI negotiations were held up by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they have actually made quite a bit of progress on areas of digital trade facilitation, like consumer protection, e-signatures, spam messages, electronic contracts, paperless trading, open government data, and transparency. But as in any trade negotiation, the most difficult issues are left to the end. So these are both substantive, like questions of data governance, source code, and market access, as well as formal questions, like the legal architecture of the JSI within the WTO. So let me leave it at that for now and hand it back to you, Colin.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. And one thing that you've highlighted is this, disagreement on whether these, the custom duty moratorium, whether these custom duties on digitally traded products are valuable or not. Is there so much revenue loss that is expected or not? We have UNCTAD that says one thing, we have the OECD that's saying another thing. So really, if anything that comes out of this capacity building or technical assistance that has come out of the co-conveners and Switzerland, of course, might be some clarification or, a very nebulous topic that some developing countries really don't know how to deal with. Now, thank you so much, Nick. And just, you've spoken about, different countries offering, as you said, China opt-outs. And there seems to be, some agreement and disagreements in what should be and what should not be in the eventual JSI. Lee will speak about it in a little bit more detail, but I just want to hear your point of view. Given, the many different interests of, the multitude of players involved in these negotiations, do you think that the WTO is still the forum to negotiate e-commerce digital trade issues, or do you see them moving on to other fora?
Well, that's a really good question, Kolo. My view is that it will be very difficult to bridge the different data governance approaches between China, the EU, and the US in the JSI, let alone in any multilateral negotiations at the WTO. So the negotiations between the EU and the US to have a new privacy shield are difficult enough in themselves. And they require the US to have a new institutional setup for the intelligence apparatus. The political environment in the US also doesn't look favorable for more transatlantic convergence on privacy and competition policy after the US midterms later this year. And that's only between the EU and the US. At the same time, you have growing geopolitical tensions with China. So I do not see how a similar arrangement would be possible with China. Now, the US probably won't agree to a JSI that doesn't have some commitments on data flows and data localization at the WTO. So the more important question is probably to what extent there will be public policy exceptions in the JSI for privacy and national security. But in the absence of an arrangement like the privacy shield, such exceptions would probably make data governance commitments in the JSI relatively meaningless. They would just be kind of face-saving devices to have at least some agreement in the WTO. Of course, the digital trade facilitation measures that seem to be a landing zone at the JSI are quite important in their own right. and they could actually transcend some of the other non-binding digital economy frameworks that we have seen, like the DIPA in the Asia Pacific, the US proposed Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and new agreements that are in the making between the EU and Japan and the EU and Singapore. But I think it would still mean that we would see more bilateral frameworks on data flows going forward that are similar to privacy shares. And that this will not happen within the WTO.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and thank you for raising those points. I mean, as we all know, members are negotiating, DEPAs or, even, full trade agreements with digital chapters, about 380 of them have been negotiated since 2000. And so, Lee, can you please just bring us back to the history of the negotiation, whether it's in the work program at the WTO or the JSI, and just give us your thoughts on what you think is possible going forward. I also just want to note, Jasmine, I've seen your comments, and just to everybody in the audience, if you have any questions, please do address them in the Q&A box. We will have a Q&A session at the end. We would be happy to address your comments and your questions. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much, Kolo. It's nice to be here with you. I'll just a thumbnail history, really. In 1998, I think we know that the work program was launched, and it was two elements. It was the work program plus the moratorium. And the original proposal, coming more from the US, was for the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions only. And it was, I think, at the insistence of developing countries that a work program was joined to that proposal so that people could understand better what they are talking about. Now, this program was split into the General Council overseeing it, and then the three main bodies of the agreements, the GATT Council, the Services Council, and the Intellectual Property Council, looking at the issues, as well as the Trade and Development Committee looking at some unique development aspects. What happened over the next, say, year and a half was extremely intense discussions of a list of issues assigned to each of these bodies by the General Council. The interesting thing is, if you looked at that list of issues, in the case of the three legal bodies that implement agreements, the list of issues implicitly went down through the different provisions of their agreements. And so you could see that in substance, what they were supposed to do was examine their respective agreements. I work on services, so for us, it was just about every provision was on the list, and try to determine if they were fit for e-commerce, if there was coverage of e-commerce, or if there wasn't, what might be lacking. At the end of 1999, early 2001, in fact, most of these bodies finished their work and sent to the General Council what ended up being called an interim report rather than a final report, mostly for political reasons, not necessarily having a lot to do with the substance of what they had been examining. The IP Council said, well, listen, there's nothing in the IP agreement that would prevent it from covering any of the technologies or kinds of patents and trademarks going on in the e-commerce sector. So we assume it applies. The GATT Council did similarly. It says that, look, all of the GATT rules apply. The only thing that's different is it's being ordered online, but once a good is then put in the mail, it's like any other good for us. So all of the GATT rules apply once it's been ordered, which in this case online, but then it goes into the distribution networks and delivery methods and goes across the border like anything else. They did say there was one question about some of these downloadable products that they might want to continue to discuss. The services did likewise. It said that essentially it's covered within the scope. Our definition is these modes of supply, cross-border commercial presence, And there's ways that e-commerce can be conducted through all of the modes of supply, not just cross-border, which is one of the misimpressions you hear a lot today. And that if in fact it even fits with, is not ruled out by the definition, that means all of the other things apply, including commitments. So if in those days, the feeling was if you already had a commitment to, say, computer services, just because they went online doesn't mean they're not covered by your commitment, instead of being sent in a CD-ROM. And that was really, I think, the trend of discussions. Now, they were stalled from making that a final report and making it sound like the final conclusions of the committee, partly, in large part, because of this question of, did a computer program that used to be sent on a CD-ROM and go through a customs officer, did that product now, because it could be completely sent online, was it now a service, or was it something like a virtual good? And a group of, in that time, in fact, Latin governments got together and said, listen, we're not going to sign off on this report till we have some guidance on this. So during the year 2000, and for the next 2 years, the General Council ambassadors, which tends to be attended by ambassadors, were trying to figure out whether these, well, they were trying to figure out what was the best way to discuss whether these things were a good or a service, or some combination thereof. For the most part, though, even though, for example, Good said there was at least one issue they might want to explore further, and the services report said that, yes, we're going in this direction, but we might want to discuss how the Telecom Annex relates to e-commerce and so on. They had a number of issues outstanding, looking at classification, for example. They basically went dormant, theoretically waiting for the General Council to provide them guidance as to who the GATT or the GATT's council should be discussing these downloadable products. And otherwise, for over 15 years, there was very little discussion at all. And then they started relaunching discussion in a fairly gentle way. I know the Services Council kept talking about it a little bit, at least, even if some of the others didn't. And the General Council had to meet every year, if for nothing else, to renew the moratorium. And every year it was on tenterhooks whether it would be renewed, because for many years it was being held hostage to an IP waiver. And increasingly, as time went on, the IP waiver became less problematic recently. And then I think something that was dangerous, instead of being held hostage to something else in the WTO, it was beginning to be challenged on its own merits, the moratorium. And that actually was a much more difficult to deal with than saying, okay, well, we'll agree to this other thing you want. Just leading up to 2017, there were papers being turned in by governments which are supposed to outline their priorities for what we would like to discuss if we discuss in more detail. And those papers, were a reflection of many of the kind of positions you see today. Many of them have been subsumed into the JSI. But I remember there were some NGOs arguing that all these horrible proposals are on the table. And I said, well, no, they aren't proposals yet. And then what happened is in 2017, the countries who wanted some more ambitious treatment decided that they were impatient with nothing happening in the work program. And the fact that now the governments who had moved from bargaining for different aspects of e-commerce to basically saying it wasn't in their interest, and putting basically the stops on any substantive discussion on what should be done on e-commerce in the WTO. And I thought that the original work program to really look at provisions of the agreements and decide whether they had lacked anything and what you might need to make sure the agreements properly covered the e-commerce, was unfortunate that was never taken up again. But I think there was a fear that with some of the countries being relatively negative, it wouldn't really progress very far anyway. So the JSI was formed in 2017. And the JSI itself now is going on 5 years of work. And you would have thought the way they were talking, we'll get like-minded countries together who all want to do something, and in a couple of years you'd have something. Well, they spent 1 year on very generic discussions, and then by this at the end of that 1 year agreed that they would actually negotiate something. And they started to then turn in what were really proposals with text. Some of them looked like complete agreements. Some of them were text of some provisions or a collection of provisions that they wanted to see. The interesting thing is, I had always thought that what would be interesting in this era, that in fact FTAs tended to be taking over from the WTO, that to see an example of where people brought the material and some of the provisions from their FTAs to the table at the WTO and see if you could integrate these things into the WTO was something I always thought would be interesting, but I didn't think it would take 5 years. So it turns out you have, like for example, on open internet or open government data, you have these arguments. Well, I use the word user in my FTA and you use the word customer in your FTA, and they'll go on for a day talking about, whose word is the better word to use in the WTO document. Well, the joint statement now, like I said, I think it's gone on longer than I thought it would go on, but they do have a consolidated text, which is a collection of these proposals. And you can see that there's a lot of commonality across things, and the differences are sometimes quite subtle. Sometimes the subtle differences have more impact or a potential, import for there being a difference of view than not. And one thing I know that their statement at MC12, I had already heard through the grapevine that the JSI was not looking to complete its work or reach any big milestone for this summer, that they were looking more at December, which their statement in fact confirms that. But they have in fact reached a fairly stable situation with 7 provisions. And that includes consumer protection, e-signatures, spam, e-contracts, paperless trading, open government data, and transparency. Those, in fact, are the easier ones. I think they are more goods oriented because we see them more as trade facilitation for e-commerce. Some of them are the kinds of things that have been supported more by China, who tends to feel that its higher priority is on goods trade and e-commerce. Some of the other provisions that are still outstanding, they're a little more controversial, not because they involve services, but they're much more important for the services trade. And I must say, one of the misimpressions that's going around, and we had Nicholas mention one of them about whether it covers content or only transmission. The other misimpression going around recently, after 25 years of discussing e-commerce, is that the moratorium doesn't apply to services traded online. And the services community and the services council people are absolutely shocked, because they, in all their discussions for 25 years, it was their understanding that it did apply to services traded online, and was very important, not because there were tariffs that you wouldn't have, but because it was a commitment not to create tariffs in the future for services. And I think there were many developing countries and developed alike who felt as though that was very valuable piece of work. So that brings us up to today. We're looking towards not a conclusion in December, according to the statement of the JSI, but the idea that they would bring out a new version of their consolidated text. It would probably still show some textual differences on the more complete provisions. It would show what looks like a very common text. The problems are yet to be dealt with, and the 2 main ones are the data-oriented problems and the architecture of the agreement in the end. Now, I feel that I don't think the work program failed. The work program basically died and became a program to look at the moratorium, but they never did what they were supposed to do from the outset, which was really provide legal advice on the provisions. That probably never will do that. And as this huge hiatus took place, at first we thought, oh, they're really busy with the Doha round. And there were some, to the extent that some people felt that improved, updated commitments in services would be good for e-commerce. I think some people were saying, well, the better commitments we get on mode 1 in this round, the better off we'll be, for e-commerce in services. Well, and the second view was, well, are we trying to create problems? We're not sure what problems we're trying to solve, because in the e-commerce space, there aren't a lot of problems. Well, eventually, the private sector brought us this data localization problem. And the trade people are looking around trying to figure out, like, what is data localization? Is it, they were trying to figure out what in our trade terminology and our trade lexicon did this relate to? We think in services that it really does, this GATS does already cover many aspects of data flows, but it obviously doesn't do anything for goods producers or goods traders. But for services traders, we have quite a lot of coverage of data flows, assuming there's a cross-border supply commitment. But even that is subject to debate in some places, less so perhaps in the Services Council. But I think that's this, you see these differences of emphasis, where the US is looking much more at the services side and the data issues. Japan is as well. The EU, it seems to be very supportive of the idea of market access, which we all think is very important, but we're not sure how doable it is. And the Chinese tend to be very much focused on the kind of trade facilitation that would help their goods that are ordered online go around the world. So that doesn't get to the data issue, which I won't really address differences on that. I think Nicholas observed something that's very true. As currently drafted, this broad self-judging exception to the data provision means I don't know why anybody couldn't sign it. So as it's drafted, because they don't have any of the disciplines that you have in the GATS on the exceptions, which includes privacy. So my question is, if you were to get a freestanding agreement with that provision, what's its relationship to the GATS exception, which can also be used for all the same things? So these kind of questions have come up. Let me stop there. I think that two things that maybe the future speakers can address is that there is a lot of support amongst developing countries for e-commerce and e-commerce work. So a lot of the issues have not been North-South issues. In fact, the worst sort of disagreements have been EU-US or Japan-US versus China. It hasn't really been a North-South. We have a number of developing countries in the JSI who they volunteer to join. So, and the other thing is, I was talking to some people yesterday with this misimpression that you have to have a provision that says the word SME in it. You do not need to have the word SME in a provision for it to cover SMEs. And in fact, throughout the entire agreement, most of the provisions are much more valuable to an SME than they are to a great big tech company who can walk in and to the president's office if they want to and cut a deal. If they have a problem, and the SMEs can't do that. So I think they're very useful to SMEs, even where you don't see them explicitly mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. And I think everybody has just seen how fraught these discussions have been. I mean, they've been going on at the WTO for 25 years. Members have, in principle, agreed on, some sort of disciplines, or at least things that they want to include in the agreement, but ultimately no agreement has been reached. And so we'll see. Actually, I just wanted to point out that what Yasmin was saying is exactly what Lee mentioned, was that there was an outcome on the moratorium, but there was just a statement stating that negotiations are still going on, and they stated that they might have some text by the end of this year. And Yasmin also points out this is not easy. These are not easy negotiations, which obviously we agree with. So Radhika, I think it would be sort of a natural segue into your presentation. What are the interests and what can we be doing better for developing countries?
Thank you, Golo. And I think, but before I give my perspective, I'll just discuss in terms of the holistic views, maybe of what developing countries can do, not specifically any configuration. And also just with a disclaimer that this is for, my views are for technical standpoints, for discussions and reflections, and not for any views of my organization per se. So first of all, if we look even in the WTO, we can say there's developing countries, but of course we have got small states and we have got LDCs. Lee pointed out that yes, there are countries that are part of the GSI which are developing countries, but then they are still small states. They are still LDCs that are not part of these broader e-commerce negotiations, and we have to just be mindful of the fact that, of course, e-commerce activities has been happening throughout the globe, right? The pandemic has shown us, even without any signature of the text of the GSI, but at different levels. So one of the key considerations of that countries in the negotiations need to reflect on is the different levels of development which countries have in terms of the digital maturity level and the digital adoption rates. Now we are talking a lot about e-commerce, and mostly as per the definition of the e-commerce, which is defined, right, in the work program or even in the text, and it's more about trading. But one of the key facts which I think everyone is missing, and I'm and Lee can correct me on this as well, because I might not have been that old when it started, but no one is actually looking into the issue of digital maturity, digital adoption vis-a-vis digital infrastructure divides that is existing, and it is more so between the developed and the developing countries, right? And when I talk about digital infrastructure, it's a plethora of things. It's hard infrastructure, and it is the soft digital infrastructure divide. So hard infrastructure is connecting the first mile to the last mile. And then of course the soft digital infrastructure divide, which is basically the skills, the know-hows, right? You can sign as many agreements as you like and then have a conclusion, but then when it comes to the implementation, that is the real challenge. And we have seen it not just talking about the JSIs, but look at other existing WTO agreements, or even in the FTAs. It's been signed, but when it comes to ratification, countries ratify, but implementation, that's the question, right? How will countries then move into implementation? Because there's cost involved, there's also capacity involved. And at the Commonwealth in 2021, what we did is that I did a paper on an assessment of digital infrastructure divide for the Commonwealth countries. We looked at the digital infrastructure in relation to access, quality, affordability, and also we gave a gender lens to that. And we found that among the countries, there is a digital divide, which is across countries, between countries, but then there's also within countries, right? And one of the things I think for key considerations where we can then get more developing countries involved is that we are talking about e-commerce, but as mentioned, we have to really unpack what contains digital trade. And again, when Lee mentioned about the JSI text, which is basically contains different proposals of countries, but in a holistic manner, if you look at it, it contains a lot, right? It contains issues which may not be explicitly shown, but implicitly it shows so much relationship between first mile and the last mile connectivity. For example, I did browse through one of the older texts, maybe the text has evolved, but just to pick out some of the things is that, for example, of course, there's issues surrounding data localization. There's issues regarding free flow of data, data privacy, customs risk management. Some of the proposals are talking about in terms of risk management. What are you going to do? Are you going to use AI or machine learning? Questions on algorithm, source code, interpretability, multimodal transport systems. I can go on and on, right? So what it all requires is that underneath all these discussions are discussions of digital infrastructure, which is complex. In my own personal experience as an economist, I had to evolve myself as a front-end developer to understand how apps are developed and source codes are made, and then what is cloud hosting and all those things. So just to get myself technologically empowered to understand better what the text will say, and how we translate this real kind of the industry knowledge into a real meaningful e-commerce agreement if we have at a multilateral level. So what we need is, of course, there's issues in terms of regulatory reforms, yes, but then also there's issues where we need to reflect on reforms in terms of systems, processes, policies, and the enabling digital infrastructure that has to be kind of in place. And of course, then when countries are mentioning about engaging more developing countries, and we talk about the development dimension that is always for the developing countries, but then we have to be very targeted. We need to understand in terms of what are these development dimensions, right? And one of the very basic things is that, you know, we need more discussions. We need a more interface in a multi-stakeholder approach. We need this collaboration between like the private sector, the tech, the government, to better basically, first of all, understand how this sector operates in terms of these contentious issues. And then only we will be able to better translate this into better policies and agreements, right? And I know that, of course, for developing countries, there's always discussions about the policy space issue, which is very important. But then by discussing these issues, empowering them to understand what it will take, of course, you can bridge the digital divide, you can bridge this policy space divide, I would say, and also have some level of equal footing in the negotiations as well. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for your intervention, Radhika. And I think for a lot of us, you know, when hearing about developing countries, especially the challenges, I mean, it's, you know, that digital divide, which is huge. And I think you also mentioned that the divide is even big on a gender perspective. And so it's not only about, you know, if developing countries do has the infrastructure, it's also about skills. And so my question to you is this. As Nicholas has discussed, and also Lee, that more and more countries are negotiating these FTAs, whether they're DEPAs or DEAs or whatever you want to call them, or full FTAs with digital chapters. Do you think that, as it stands, developing countries have the capacity to be making commitments in digital trade? And if not, there's this capacity gap. Who do you think should be responsible for filling this capacity gap? And if they do, what do you think the offensive interests of developing countries, maybe the larger ones, are at this stage?
Okay, so in terms of, first of all, in terms of the FTAs, I know there are different FTAs, but if I look into the JSI text, and then of course, if I try to rewrite to some language of FTAs, I think the CPTPP is one of the FTAs. There's certain things that's resonating from there, and then also in terms of some language which is quite close but not really there from the RCEP, right? First of all, for countries to actually kind of engage, of course, there's a lot of other factors that's involved: trade interest, the trade creation, trade diversion, what is their comparative and their competitive advantage. So of course, for the bigger developing countries, they have got this advantage, right? Like for certain countries, like say, for example, India is huge on trade in services, right? That is their main sector. So of course, they might have certain advantage in that area. But then again, for a country to engage, it's, of course, the decision is sovereign to them. We as advisors can only kind of advise. But having said that, there's of course capacity gap is always there, right? So if I would not rule out that, okay, developing countries cannot engage in JSI, they can engage, some are engaging, but in terms of the capacity gap, that actually needs to be enhanced. And also I would be, looking at the e-commerce work program of 1998, which Lee mentioned, I see a lot in there. Of course, Lee rightfully mentioned about trade in services, goods, IP. But then there's one, one of the lines, I forgot, is it 1.3 or something, where there's only one line to say, okay, we will also kind of recognize or take into consideration, or this is a language, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist, so pardon me, in terms of infrastructure. And then when I look at the Committee on Trade and Development, they are saying that in that work program on the JSI, on the e-commerce, they are actually talking about certain things, right? We will look at the impact, we will of e-commerce and how it impacts and all those, which is fair and fine. But I think we need to really be honest amongst ourselves and look at to the real hardcore issues as well, right? And expand on it. So in terms of capacity areas, if someone were to ask me, what would be the capacity areas that you think would be more important to discuss or give to developing countries as a whole, I would say about the digital skills, which I always say the soft digital infrastructure capabilities needs to be developed, the hard infrastructure capabilities. There needs to be a strong discussion on a strong digital infrastructure ecosystem of infrastructure services, platform services, software services. These are new areas. For maybe trade experts, learnings are required. Of course, better access, affordability, and quality of new existing and new infrastructure is important, because without that you cannot go online and you cannot trade, right? And then of course there's this, I'd say, infrastructure advantage, which leads to comparative advantage of countries too, right? In terms of trading. And of course, at the end, it's about market access, it's about trade interest. So the countries that have better access have first mover advantage, right? And then of course, developing targeted skills that cross-cut between trade and technology. It is important. Examples are in the field of machine learning, AI, software development, cybersecurity, cloud infrastructure. Why I'm bringing all this up? Because if you read the entire JSI text, it is mapping all these things, but it is implicit, it is not explicit. But if we sit down and we kind of unravel it and really show, okay, for source code, it equates to this kind of skills for understanding and for implementation. For data localization, it's about servers, so it's about cloud infrastructure, you know, and so forth. So that kind of trade technology mapping needs to be done. Of course, regulatory reforms, that is to be there. And also, yes, many developing countries have got large MSMEs and SMEs. So SMEs and tech development, right? And then of course, this kind of discussion has to happen. And yes, empowerment of youth and gender. Why I'm always focusing on this is, of course, the developing countries have a lot of youth dividend, right? But then the skills also need to be developed in this digital economy geared towards that. And if we are talking about developing the soft digital infrastructure skills, it's about youth development, right? Developing their skills. So who does it? Finally, who does it and how we do it? Okay, a multidisciplinary approach is needed, right? Because technology is cross-cutting in every sector. Government, tech companies, academia all need to work together, because one person on their own cannot kind of solve this plethora of issues. It's basically impossible. Yeah,
I agree with you, Radhika. Thank you so much for highlighting. I mean, it's a huge field that, as Radhika says, cannot be dealt with by one actor. Before Kwan jumps in, Lee had a comment. So Lee, if I could please ask you to keep your comment brief so that we can then hear Kwan's intervention before we jump very quickly to Q&A.
Yeah, let me just say, I agree with Radhika that there's been, in fact, there's been a lot of talk about digital divide in the work program. I think that it's not that they've done things about it, because that's not what the WTO does. So I think she's also right in her final remark that this is something that e-commerce involves a variety of agencies, a variety of stakeholders, many of whom are properly placed to provide this kind of assistance. Some of it is World Bank, some of it is, you know, bilateral assistance in some of these areas. Some of it is coming from the private sector directly. And that's where it should come from, because these are the people that can do this mapping and know these things. It's not the job of the WTO. This is one of the problems with doing it. The last thing I'll say is, in the telecom annex, for example, there was a provision calling for members to help with capacity building. Now, I gave a lot of conferences where seminars where I helped them understand how their legal framework in telecom would be consistent with the WTO, and I stopped there. You know, they were getting a lot of bilateral and multilateral assistance to actually help their regulators get up to speed and you know, get things done well. So that's the way the telecom annex provision on that was interpreted, is that members would do it, not the WTO does it. So.
Thank you so much, Leif. Thank you for that perspective. And actually, Radhika, you already set up Kwan's intervention very well, in that, the backbone of many economies are SMEs and not these large MNCs. And so, Kwan, can you please just give us the perspective of them as SMEs or MISMEs, micro, small, medium enterprises, and exactly what they can gain and what more can be done to enhance their integration into the digital infrastructure and economy?
Thank you very much, Kolo, and thanks for inviting me to this webinar. And same as Radhika, I'll make a disclaimer that the views are my own, not representing any agencies. But ITC, is a SME-focused agency. So we do a lot of technical assistance, capacity building for SMEs in different countries. And a lot of our projects are related to e-commerce. So, and we have done a global survey, I think at the beginning when the GSI started, just to see what are the real concerns of SMEs in the e-commerce policy discussions. And I think back at that time, what we hear from SMEs is that e-commerce actually do bring new trade opportunities. In our survey, 80% of the micro companies, which is less than 5 employees, that have started trading are trading through cross-border e-commerce. And also the survey also shows that the e-commerce, particularly cross-border e-commerce, brings opportunities for women-owned enterprises. If we compare the samples from the micro companies that are trading offline or traditional exporters versus the ones that are trading through e-commerce, the ratio of women-owned enterprises actually doubles. It's essentially the small family businesses that can operate from home, from garage, from backyards. So they do, cross-border e-commerce does bring opportunities for SMEs, but that doesn't mean that the SMEs doesn't have any difficulties or challenges, and actually challenges are quite significant for them to fully benefit from the new opportunities generated by e-commerce. And just for example, in relation to operation on e-commerce platforms, there are SMEs tell us that, for example, some of them from certain countries, they can still not register as sellers on the platforms. The platforms often request high cost of membership for meaningful opportunities, because in many cases the registration is free, but you don't get any traffic to your shop. And if you want to attract traffic, then you have to buy promotion packages or membership fees. Sometimes the registration requirements for the sellers could be very complex, requiring all kinds of documents that micro companies probably don't have. And also the lack of data interoperability and transferability means that the SMEs are bound to certain platforms, and it's not easy to switch to other platforms. So basically, I mean, obviously, we're talking about the rules, WTO setting rules for e-commerce, and not all of these can be addressed by the WTO. And I think just coming to the what WTO can do, we have, I think Nicholas has set a very good context of talking about moratorium, about GSI. Just wanted to add a few sort of my own perspective on the issues that has been discussed in relation to the moratorium, the revenue loss. I think the moratorium in itself has some loopholes, as we had discussed before. I mean, whether does it include content or it only refers to the medium, and what does electronic transmission mean that has been an issue that has been debated in the WTO for a long time. And also at the time, I think members were recognizing that technically it was not feasible to apply a tariff, because essentially everything is transmitted across border, and there's no physical border in the digital space. How do you put a virtual customs in the digital world? But I think that relates to why some countries might think that it can become a possibility in the future, because essentially with Web3 and also the blockchain technologies, every transaction will be recorded, you know where it's coming from, who is it's selling to. So technically, it might be possible to trace back, you know, who is selling to whom and whether that transaction is cross-border. So then linked to that, the technical feasibility issue might be resolved. Regarding the assessment of revenue loss, I think it's really an interesting topic, because if we look at the revenue loss only from the perspective of digitizable products like books and CDs and videotapes, the trade in those kind of products has been quite low for developing countries. Import, export, I mean, mostly import. But I think what has shifted by the technology is that everything has become online. CDs were replaced by streaming music streaming services. DVDs were replaced by Netflix, and that's where the real concern is. I think no one is talking about what are we still importing books or CDs or DVDs. It's rather about the issue is rather about profit shifting, I think, for the big companies, where they shift their profits to low tax jurisdictions and try to pay less taxes. And that is a problem not only for developing countries, but also for developed countries. That's why I think the OECD has been talking about this global tax of 15%. So that is real, where the real issue is. That from a developing perspective, developing country perspective, you see that companies generate revenue from the users in developing countries, but they don't pay taxes there. Same applies for other developed countries where the companies don't pay taxes. I think Lee has given us a very comprehensive review of the negotiation history. I still recall some of the discussions that we had regarding the GATS, whether the GATS provisions are sufficient to cover the data or internet-related services. The challenge there has been, I think, a few folds. Firstly, it's related to the classification. So W120 was developed in 1980s, I guess. And it has classifications like paging services or fax services, but it doesn't have the kind of fundamental internet service provider service that we have today. And it's been difficult to classify those because essentially, how do you classify a search engine service? If we take a look at the search engine, users don't pay search engines to do search, right? It's search engines get their revenues from the companies who sell advertisements. So they get revenue from advertising. So what do they provide? Is it a computer-related services? Is it an advertising service? So that's the kind of difficulty with these new business models, how to capture them. And also regarding, I think what GATS probably doesn't fully capture is the measures. All of these measures that we're talking about in the GSIs, in the FTAs, measures on data governance, privacy, localization, those are not the measures that you can kind of classify into the market access or national treatment. Well, it probably can be addressed through additional commitments, but it's the different kind of measure that has been envisaged by the WTO framework. So I think those are quite interesting debates that kind of brings back the memory of when I was a delegate doing those research. And also, I think on goods versus services, it's an interesting that we see in more recent FTAs and RTAs, for example, in DEPA and others, the increasingly reference is made to digital products. And then you have the footnote saying that, you know, digital products doesn't really prejudge your positions on whether those are goods or services. So that might be a solution, because if you classify or if you characterize it as a digital product, then you can apply the MFN treatment, the national treatment provisions to it. So basically, just to share some thoughts on the issues that has been discussed. I think the GSI has a long way to go, especially on the core provisions related to data, because I think the gaps in the position are quite significant, especially for countries that I mean, all developing countries want to, I mean, the ones that we talk to want to have their own digital champions. You know, we want to have our own Alibabas, we want to have our own Amazons. But how to do that? You know, whether you can achieve that through certain kind of industrial policy type of things. So that's I think remains debatable. But yeah, I'll stop here and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Kwan, and thank you for your interventions. And I think just, you know, you mentioning, you know, things changing because technical feasibility and this concept of, you know, virtual customs office, and talking about the focus now on the customs duty moratorium. It's not only about the goods or the digital products. It's also talking about, you know, taxing the service providers, the service suppliers. So these issues are very, very complicated and also unresolved. Ladies and gentlemen, we have gone 4 minutes after our end time, but I would like to give the audience, if they have one question, I know this is a lot of pressure, and I see that Yasmin has a question in the chat box, and she says, it would be interesting to hear from Lee how a WTO dispute settlement has dealt with cases over services classification over time. So Lee, if you can just give us a quick rundown on the cases that have dealt with commitments that were made before the digital era that now have to be interpreted into the digital era.
Well, I must say that clearly a lot of the services cases have been on online services, okay? And I don't think there was any question of whether it was a good or a service with the gambling case, the first case. In fact, one of the great proponents of e-commerce, the US, found itself in the awkward position of trying to argue its commitments didn't apply to it being done over internet. And I said to the American delegate after the case was over, I said, you know, you really would have killed your whole e-commerce, you know, initiative if you had won on that argument that none of the commitments could be supplied over internet. So we've had a lot of cases online. The only case that potentially broached this goods versus services issue was the China audiovisual products. Now, Interestingly, though, I am told by experts in the WTO that case was able to sidestep the issue of whether these downloadable music was a good or a service, because China had not used the standard classification of what do you call them, titles, or they had created their own, which is always a risk in that, that was called music distribution. So what the case did is it focused onto the distribution aspect of the way it titled that commitment and said, well, distribution is clearly a service. So it was able to sidestep the issue of whether what was being distributed was a good or a service, but that the act of distribution was a service. So that was dealt with as a services component of the case. The problem really, and there hasn't been enough dispute settlement since then, because I think a lot of the software industry and the other aspects of the computer industry, I think Kwan's right, they're not sure where they fit. I think of a lot of us have a feeling that they do fit many things. Search engines, I think, fit easily into some of the computer services, but I think industry doesn't want to bring a case when they don't have any certainty that it will be dismissed outright because they weren't covered by the classification. And so that's a big risk for them. So you haven't seen these kind of cases be brought. The trouble is actually more political. The trouble is that two major members, the US and the EU, have diametrically opposed positions on this. I guess it's lucky for the dispute settlement system that it wasn't forced to decide between those two. But it's one of the things that this word digital products that Kwan mentioned, every time that provision in the JSI comes up, the EU takes the floor and says it refuses to allow the word digital products even to be used because in their view, they're services. So you have this very entrenched, I mean, over so many years, every once in a while, I'll check with the EU or check with the US. Have you guys made any progress on reaching a compromise on this? And they haven't. And their positions are getting more and more entrenched. So dispute settlement aside, it is a political problem between two major members.
Thank you so much, Lee. And I mean, we've also, seen it in the EPS, the China EPS dispute as well. All of these things, as Lee was saying, have become digital, even though the commitments were made before the digital era. And although there was sort of an agreement, as Lee had mentioned, that these would transcend into the digital era, I think some members would be slow to agree that what they committed upon in the late 1980s.
It only needs the package to be delivered. And
exactly, just needs the package to be delivered.
The US document was that they were actually still goods. I don't know.
That's true. So we're back to the goods and services dichotomy. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience. I know we've gone over time, but thank you to the panel for such a riveting discussion. And if only just to highlight that these issues are far from being settled. And as Yasmin said, it will probably take a while, even beyond this year, to finish the GSI. And we'll see what we come up with. It might be a very, very thin agreement that just basically deals with trade facilitation, as China would love. And so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending. Please keep your eye out for future trade policy exchange events. We'd love to welcome you and would love to exchange with you. Please follow us to join us on our platforms, and we'll continue this conversation. Thanks a lot again, and take care. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.